Alrighty guys, welcome back to Write Better Stories. My name is Daniel Backer and this is my son Lawrence. Before we get into our video today, I wanted to mention that I'm going to a wig party tonight, and so I have to buy a wig. Yeah, I kind of hate costume parties because I have to spend money in order to do something for one night, and so I'm not overly eager to do this, but I guess there's going to be a lot of dip there as well. Chips and dip. So I am looking forward to that part of things. And I think I'm not going to drink alcohol tonight. I think instead I'm going to drink some matcha tea before I go, because matcha tea makes me feel really good. And yeah, I'll put in an update to let you know how that goes. I have drank coffee before. Drunken? I have drunken? All the EN words always mess me up. I have had coffee before a party before, and it was actually great results because you end up being the sharpest, most talkative one there. But today I'm going to put in the third installment of this story series that I'm doing and kind of trying to put everything together. And yeah, let's get into it. So we talked in our first episode about the idea of character action and defining your character and how that is such a vital part of the storytelling process. And then in the second video I talked about the idea of the anticipation of action so that you can basically connect your scenes together and create a plot. And in this video we're going to try to put all of that together into some sort of a story. So I think that there's a lot of information about structure and about the story circle, the hero's journey, I'm sure you guys have heard of before, and I think that these things can be very inspirational, but sometimes I think that they can be confusing and not necessarily beneficial, especially if you're just starting out, or even if you have been writing for a long time. I think it can sort of turn into a set of rules that you're supposed to be following that there's nothing really to validate those rules. Like, why did we let Joseph Campbell decide that this is what all of the stories are like? Can't we think of examples of stories that don't necessarily follow the story circle? Now, on a side note, the book that he wrote about the story circle or the hero's journey, called The Hero with a Thousand Faces, is very interesting. And I've never finished it, but the parts of it that I have read have given me a lot of inspiration and different ideas for scenes. But one complaint that I have about it is that a lot of the examples that he uses are just very unrelatable. He'll be like, oh, we see this story all over the place, like in traditional Norse mythology, or this old story written in 1200. And unless you're like a scholar, I have a hard time relating to these, and I was not very interested to go and try to investigate whether those examples he gave are true. I assume that they are, but I think a lot of people that are writing today or learning to write today don't necessarily relate to those kinds of stories that were written so long ago. It might be more helpful to come up with some more relatable references. So I'm going to attempt to do that today. But this is where I want to kind of get into this idea of process, because I don't think that you necessarily have to use some sort of external structure in order to create your story. And I think that it can actually hurt, because if you are trying to follow my advice and guide your story with character action and the anticipation of action, sometimes it can feel like you're just trying to plug these things into these arbitrary categories that somebody else created, whether it's the story circle, the hero's journey, the 3-act structure, the 8 sequences of a film. There's a lot of different examples of these, and they can be very helpful, but my guess is that a lot of the people that have written successful stories that follow these things, it's not necessarily that they were trying to follow this structure, but rather the structure was developed based on the successful execution of that story. And so what I strongly recommend doing, specifically when you're starting a story, is to not necessarily outline something. And this is heresy. I think that a lot of people are very into this idea of outlining, and I am specifically against it, at least at the beginning of the story. So I'm going to get back to that in a moment. But I think when you're first starting out, you want to really let inspiration lead your process. And so rather than trying to come up with a list of all of these scenes that you want to see in your story, I say just like dive into it. Just start writing a scene, giving your character actions that are exciting to write about. And A lot of times this will give you a ton of scenes and you don't end up using all of them, but that's fine. This is this idea of a process called discovery that I learned in improv. So if you come in, and I think specifically in improv comedy, if you come in with too much of an idea about what your scene is going to be, you're so much in the left brain and so much into developing what a teacher named Susan Messing referred to as a thesis for what your scene is going to be about. And then when the other people around you don't adhere to your thesis, you feel like they're wrong. But this is a good example of why you shouldn't dictate too much at the beginning of a scene or a story of what it's going to be about. You come in with an idea of a character and see what their character action is. Give them a good idea of what it's going to be, and then just kind of let them go. Let them explore and see the consequences of those actions. So especially in that first phase of the writing process, just try to come up with a bunch of different scenes that are really exciting to you, and then that's the point. Once you have all of those, almost like paints on a palette, you have all of these scenes that are exciting to you and vivid, that's when you should make your outline after that. You can start making logical conclusions based on what you've written about and the character actions, and then start piecing those into an outline at that point. And then usually what will happen, like I just alluded to, is that some of the scenes just aren't going to fit, and that's just part of the writing process. You're not going to end up using every single thing that you wrote down, regardless, whether you make an outline or you do it in this method that I'm talking about here. But what also happens is that you'll come up with this outline halfway through the process, and you'll realize that there are more scenes that you need to write. So this is when you can go through a second phase of writing to kind of fill in the gaps, connect those scenes with the anticipation of action like I talked about in the second video, and develop a plot that's consistent to the internal choices that you've made so far, not trying to plug into these kind of arbitrary things that someone else has decided on. Now, ironically, what usually happens is if you really commit to this process and you go through several waves of edits and a lot of different rewrites and plugging in new scenes, is that you'll find that a neat structure develops outside of that. So I think it just prevents you from getting into this idea of feeling like you have to adhere to this thing. So let's get a little bit more concrete about this. If you decide that you're going to write a story and you plot out an outline before you even hit the page, this kind of gets you into this feeling that your story is already done. It exists somewhere in the ether, and it's your job at this point in order to bring it down to earth. But the thing is, what is so special about this abstract story that you've created? Nothing validates that as a story that even works. It might make sense in your head, but then once you're bringing it down to paper, at least what I always experience is I'm trying to turn this outline into scenes, and it's just boring. It feels like I'm like following this set of rules. And again, what made those rules so special? What makes that the story that you're actually supposed to write? And so if you can inject this process of discovery into it, then you can end up coming up with details along the way through just free writing based on your character and your character actions that come up with details that you really couldn't have planned. And so this is one of the best parts about the process to me, and it ends up becoming much more mysterious and magical because things pop out along the way when you're not trying to just create a thesis, and you do discover what your story ends up being about. So people are resistant to this idea, I think, because it is so kind of free. It's so structureless at the beginning, but again, I think there's a lot to be gained from just not assuming too much from the get-go of what this thing is even going to be about. And I can say, particularly with my first book that I wrote, I did not plan it to be the way that it was. I had actually planned on writing this story about somebody who couldn't get over somebody from their past, and that was just obviously what it was going to be for me. But then little by little, as I was writing it, it turned into this story about a guy who moved in with a monk, and this monk was trying to teach him a spiritual path. So that was something that I kind of stumbled on along the way. I had no intention when I started to write that story, but if I had stuck to my outline or what my plan of what my story would have been, then I never would have gotten to that thing. And all of the details about this someone who couldn't get over somebody from their past, they didn't even make it into the final draft. All of that ended up getting cut. Now, people might look at that and realizing that it's completely wasted time, but it actually ends up being just a diving board to get into the more interesting things. You kind of have to start out with something more tangible so that you can dive into that more mysterious world. Now, just to wrap everything up too, I think that something that you can look at structurally, at least in order to guide these character actions, so it's not just a complete, just a bunch of character actions strung together, is this idea of a character change throughout the course of the story. So one of the best and most classic examples of this is in A Christmas Carol. And if you haven't seen it, this is something as a writer you should really see, because it's so clear. I think it'd be pretty difficult to see or read A Christmas Carol and be like, it's up to interpretation, we don't know what it's about. No, it's like, it's pretty obviously about this guy who cannot appreciate the spirit of Christmas. Ebenezer Scrooge, he is very selfish, he is a miser, and over the course of his journey, he learns to basically connect with other people and understand the true spirit of giving, the true spirit of Christmas. You get the idea. Now, another really good example of this is in the first season of True Detective, with Matthew McConaughey's character that, like I talked about in a previous video, he is kind of similar to Ebenezer Scrooge, although he's not as much of a miser as he is just a nihilist. He doesn't believe that humans have any worth. When he's looking at the pictures of the dead bodies, he says that they're relieved to die, so he's not a big fan of life, or doesn't see a lot of value in that. And huge spoiler alert for the first season one of True Detective is that by the end of the series, we see a complete transformation of this character, that he ends up confronting some sort of supernatural happening when he's on his, or in a near-death experience, and he basically starts asserting all kinds of non-nihilistic things. Like, he basically says that he came up with an overpowering feeling of love where he connected with his daughter who had died, and beforehand, anything that somebody said was just a narrative. You really see that in his scenes at the church when he's talking about religion is just like a silly narrative that people have come up with. But then at the end, he's gazing up at the stars and realizing it's all just a big, beautiful story. And it's a pretty radical transformation. And then specifically, they hit it right on the head at the end, that Woody Harrelson's character asks him, or they say something along the lines of, when they're looking up at the stars, it's just a big battle or a big story about light and dark. And then Woody Harrelson looks up and says, oh, but it looks like the dark has a lot more territory. And just to completely sum everything up, Matthew McConaughey says, if you ask me, it looks like the light is starting to win. So that is a complete reversal from what he had experienced at the beginning of that story, someone who was such a nihilist, to kind of have this radical assertion of positivity at the end of the story. And there are just a million examples of this in great stories of somebody going through a dominant character change throughout their story. And that's something that you can look to put into your story. Now, I also want to attach a caveat to that, is that there's a really strong trend in a lot of stories, where the character does not change. And a really good example of this is in the movie White Men Can't Jump. Now, a lot of people will laugh when I say this because it is kind of a silly title for a movie, and if you haven't seen it in a long time, it's easy to remember it as maybe just a silly comedy, but this is a fantastic movie and a really good example of all of the things that I talk about in these previous videos of character action, the anticipation of action, and a really strong character change, specifically for Woody Harrelson's character. And that was not intentional to choose two Woody Harrelson stories for this, but this is a really good example of a character who doesn't necessarily change. And so I'm going to try to go through White Men Can't Jump so that you guys can get a better grasp of this journey that he goes on. But this is another movie. If you haven't seen it, go watch White Men Can't Jump. It is just such an economically written, excellent, entertaining movie. A great Los Angeles movie. A lot of it's shot out in Venice. And Wesley Snipes has a killer performance in it. But basically, the defining character action with which Woody Harrelson is introduced is this idea of hustling in basketball. So his kind of hustle that he does is he goes up to Venice Beach and he dresses like a nerdy white guy, and he basically gets other people to challenge him to a game, and then he reveals, hey, I'm actually really good at basketball, and that's how he makes his money. So this is an introduction that basically tells you what the entire film is going to be about. It's about people who hustle playing basketball. So where this gets interesting, and where the idea of the character action structurally ends up becoming what the story is that Wesley Snipes also hustles in basketball, and he basically teams up with Woody Harrelson early in the movie in order to hustle other people, but then it turns out that Wesley Snipes is hustling Woody Harrelson. And so what ends up happening is that they get together and Wesley Snipes keeps missing shots and the game doesn't go well, and then Woody Harrelson realizes that they lose the game, but then later in the story he realizes that he's been hustled, and he shows up, and the people that they were hustling or supposedly hustling end up being in on it with Wesley Snipes. And so not only does Woody Harrelson get hustled as a character, but you as an audience member sort of get hustled, because they don't tell you that. They reveal that throughout the course of the story. So when you see Wesley Snipes sitting with all of these other people, it's this reveal that you as well have been hustled. You didn't know what was going on, and they sort of peel back the surface. So I think that's a pretty good example of how character action and structure can meet, and that'd be a lot more interesting, I think, than if they had tried to plug their individual character actions into some externally imposed structure. They found out a way that the character action can become the structure of the story. So very interesting move on that part. But then little by little, what his journey ends up being about is that he is so into this hustling thing that he's really letting his girlfriend down. And it's a brilliant performance by Rosie Perez. She is so, you just fall in love with her over the course of this movie, and you just are so mad at Woody Harrelson for letting this woman down. But her character introduction is really good as well, because she has as a goal in order to get on Jeopardy. That's her big kind of American dream, that she doesn't want to have to work for a living like the rest of them hustling, and so she wants to win Jeopardy and make a bunch of money. And so her character introduction is her sitting on the bed with I think it's an encyclopedia, maybe it's a dictionary, but it's a really well-framed shot, and she just comes down and her head kind of pops up behind it, and this is basically her studying for Jeopardy. And so just within that first shot of her in the story, you kind of get everything that you need to know about her, at least in her role in the story. So then Woody Harrelson keeps signing up for these different competitions in order to win money, and his issue within the story ends up becoming that he is so addicted to winning and his own pride that he ends up making a lot of stupid choices when he's already won. And so what happened, or won, I found out recently that I say won incorrectly. I say it W-O-N, like won, but it's actually won, apparently. I got very late in life before I realized that. But there's a scene when, after Wesley Snipes has hustled Woody Harrelson, that Rosie Perez realizes that he's been hustled, and so she hops on the bus to go get the money back. And Woody Harrelson is like, you can't get the money back, that's just against the rules. And she has this really good monologue where she basically says, here's the thing, sometimes when you win, you actually lose. And sometimes when you lose, you actually win. And then she says something to the effect of, winning and losing is just an organic globule from which one extracts what one needs. Now, Woody Harrelson doesn't get this, and this ends up being like his central problem as a character. He just thinks that winning is the most important thing. He's got to get the money. He's got to basically prove to everybody else that he can play basketball, that he's really good. And he just is like, what in the heck are you talking about? And so if that doesn't totally make sense to you, what she said, what I take from that is that it's really not about whether you win or lose, and it's not about how you play the game. It's about advancing your objectives. Like, if you end up compromising yourself as a person but you still win the game, you've actually kind of lost. And if you end up losing but you lose with integrity, then you've actually kind of won. And so, or won. So, like she says, winning and losing is just an organic globule from which one extracts what one needs. And so they basically confront Wesley Snipes and his girlfriend and yada yada yada. But then by the end of the movie, when his character action should have, or his character change should have taken place, he gets to a point where he hasn't changed. And so he ends up signing up to hustle once again with the money that Rosie Perez wins from Jeopardy, and he's all excited to tell her, it's like, hey, I'm going to bet all your money in this thing. And she was all excited that he was going to stop hustling and he was going to get a good job and turn his life around. And so he ends up saying this, and then she basically breaks up with him. She doesn't say it outright, but she just says goodbye and goes away. So he loses the girl, and then they end up winning the tournament, but he goes back to the hotel and she's not there, and he's trying to piece back together the monologue that she has on the bus. He's like, winning and losing is just an organic globule, and he doesn't really understand it. But then, rather than him changing as a character, what actually ends up changing is his circumstances. He's lost and experienced consequences for what he's done, and that can be, I know that was a long-winded thing, but that can be an opportunity for you to basically create a little bit more ebb and flow within your story. If you are trying to go for something where the character does not change, doesn't learn a lesson, that's totally fine, but the idea of there being consequences and fallout and a shift in circumstance is something that can make it so that it's not just this kind of non-dynamic piece. There's still this idea of dynamism within your story. And lastly, I'm going to see if... Oh, I'm still recording. Damn, this is a long video. That was unintentional. The last example that I wanted to give of this is in the movie Inherent Vice. This was based on a book by Thomas Pynchon, and to be perfectly honest, I was not inspired to read the book, but it's by Paul Thomas Anderson, and that guy is no slouch when it comes to directing. And he does a really good example in this movie of somebody who goes through a big character change throughout their journey. And so in the first scene of Inherent Vice, Joaquin Phoenix's character's girlfriend comes back and she's crying because this guy hurt her. And what I interpret from this scene is that he basically does like an economic evaluation of her sadness, that she's all bummed out and she's talking to him, and he basically is like, well, who hurt you? How much money did you owe him, or did he give you money? Something like that. But it's a very kind of cerebral, cold, he's not comforting her. He's just like, you know what, we're going to figure this out. We're going to logically try to determine what goes on. And at the end of the scene, she turns to him and she goes, Doc, you know this doesn't mean that we're back together, right? And he's like, right. But you kind of get throughout the course of the story that he wants to be back with this girl. He's very much pining after her. And so he goes on his entire journey, and what you end up extracting from the story, said a little bit more explicitly than they might say in other stories, because it is the like lofty writing of Thomas Pynchon, that it's very much a story about trying to own people. And the way that I arrived at that idea is, the book is called Inherent Vice, and they basically describe that as a principle on the high seas of anything that you can't put insurance on, because glass is going to break, ice cream is going to melt. And then Joanna Newsom, who's one of my favorite artists of all time, I'll do videos about her later, she basically says at one point that if glass is going to break and ice cream is going to melt, what does that mean for ladies or somebody that you're in love with? And it's that idea is you can't really put insurance on that. It's not something that you can own. And they get into more theme about that with this idea of private property. The guy who broke her heart was a real estate investor, and he gets thrown in a loony bin because he says that he woke up from he had a hippie dream that he was trying to sell something that should have been free. And so I hope I'm describing this well. It seems like I'm losing it a little bit, but the idea is that he goes through this entire journey that's all about ownership and insurance and people revolving in and out of each other's lives, and then they don't give you a lot of context for the last scene, but his girlfriend from the first scene is crying on his shoulder again, and he at this point says to her, you know this means that we're not back together. And so even though they're in a similar situation as where they started, he sort of learned that this girl is somebody that he's obviously in love with, but she's going to revolve in like a planet and eventually leave him, because you can't own people. They have their own lives, and that's a pretty powerful thing to learn. So I think I'm going to make another video talking about that more in depth, because I've gone on long enough for this one. But please leave any comments in the comment section if you guys need some more clarification, and gals. And yeah, if you have any suggestions for future videos, this is the end of this particular story series, but I'm definitely going to be putting in some more videos in the future. So thank you very much. Bye. Lawrence, do you want to say goodbye? Oh, he was sleeping. We'll let him sleep. Okay.